In 1834, the new overseer of Stone March Plantation arrived with a record no one dared repeat aloud: 70 enslaved people dead under his command. By his first sunset, he had already added another body to that count, forcing every man and woman on the plantation to stare at the ground while he boasted that no one had ever challenged him and lived. But as he scanned the line, he noticed one worker who didn't flinch, didn't bow, didn't move at all. Kato Briggs, the man other overseers had abandoned their posts to avoid. Within a week, the overseer would swing his whip at that silent figure, certain he could break him like the others. And by the following month, the plantation's ledgers, labor rolls, and even the overseer's name would vanish from the records entirely. What exactly happened the moment he attacked the one man everyone else feared? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The dust rose in pale clouds behind Corbin Hale's horse as he rode through the front gates of Stone March Plantation. The morning sun cut low across the fields, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. He sat tall in the saddle, back straight, eyes forward. This was his 53rd plantation in 17 years. He knew how first days worked. The gate creaked shut behind him. Corbin had killed 73 people. He did not need to remember their faces. What mattered was that others remembered his. Plantation owners across Mississippi whispered his name when their workers grew restless. They paid him well to restore order. They paid him even better to make examples. He dismounted near the main house, boots hitting packed earth with a solid thud. A thin man in a gray vest waited on the porch steps, hands clasped behind his back. Samuel Whitlock, the plantation owner's younger brother. Corbin had met men like Samuel before, men who watched violence from a distance and called it necessity. Mr. Hale. Samuel's voice carried the careful politeness of someone greeting a dangerous animal. "Welcome to Stone March." Corbin nodded once. "Show me the operation." They walked the grounds together. Samuel spoke in measured tones about acreage and yields, about the cotton press and the storage barns. Corbin barely listened. He watched the workers in the distant fields instead, noting their movements, their pace. Discipline could be read in how people moved when they thought no one important was watching. "You'll find our workers particular," Samuel said quietly as they passed the quarters. "We've had 5 overseers in 3 years. Good men, experienced men. None of them lasted." Corbin's jaw tightened. They weren't good enough. Perhaps. Samuel stopped walking. Or perhaps Stone March requires a different approach. There's only one approach that works. Corbin turned to face him. Fear. Applied correctly. Applied immediately. Samuel's expression flickered with something Corbin couldn't quite read. Doubt, maybe. Or pity. Either way, it didn't matter. "The workers muster at dawn," Samuel said. "You'll want to introduce yourself." "I will." By the time the sun cleared the tree line, Corbin had positioned himself in front of the main barn. The enslaved workers filed in from the quarters, forming rough lines in the dirt yard. Men, women, some children, maybe 200 in total. Their faces showed the familiar blankness that came from years of hiding thoughts. Corbin let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel his presence, to understand what his arrival meant. He walked along the front line slowly, boots crunching on gravel. Every eye tracked him, except one pair. At the far end of the assembly stood a man taller than the rest, broad shoulders, arms thick with muscle. He kept his gaze forward, not on Corbin, but on some distant point beyond the fields. His stillness was different from the others. Theirs was the stillness of prey. His was something else entirely. Corbin filed that observation away and returned his attention to the crowd. He stopped in front of a young man near the middle. Thin face, calloused hands. The man's breathing quickened slightly when Corbin stared at him. "What's your name?" Corbin asked. "Reuben, sir." "You work the fields?" "Yes, sir." You work hard? Reuben hesitated. Yes, sir. I do my best, sir. Corbin nodded slowly. Your best isn't good enough. The words hung in the morning air. Reuben's eyes widened. Sir, Corbin drew his pistol and fired once. The shot cracked across the yard like a whip. Reuben crumpled. Blood spread dark across the dirt. Women gasped. Children turned their faces away. But no one screamed. No one ran. Corbin holstered the weapon and surveyed the crowd. I don't accept excuses. I don't accept laziness. I don't accept anything less than absolute obedience. Is that understood? Silence. I asked if that was understood. Yes, sir. The response came in a low murmur from dozens of throats. Corbin waited for the panic to set in, for the tears, for the breaking point where fear became submission. He had seen it on every plantation. Violence opened a door. Terror walked through, but the workers didn't break. They stood in formation, backs straight, eyes forward. Their stillness had a quality Corbin didn't recognize. It felt coordinated, purposeful. Then he saw it. Several people glanced toward the tall man at the end. Just brief flicks of their eyes. A woman in the second row. An older man near the front. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12. They looked to him the way sailors looked to a lighthouse in a storm. The tall man didn't acknowledge them. He stood utterly motionless, hands loose at his sides, face expressionless, but his presence seemed to radiate outward like heat from a fire. Corbin felt irritation prickle up his spine. He was the one who should command their attention. He was the one who had just killed a man in front of them. Their fear should be his. Get to work, he said sharply. The crowd dispersed in orderly rows, heading toward the fields. No one spoke. No one looked back at Reuben's body. They moved like a single organism, each person knowing exactly where to go. Samuel appeared at Corbin's elbow. His face had gone pale. That was direct. That was necessary. Corbin wiped dust from his jacket. They understand now. Do they? Samuel's voice carried an edge Corbin didn't like. They will. Samuel glanced toward the fields where the workers were already spreading out among the cotton rows. His shoulders tensed. The tall one, at the end of the line. Did you notice him? I noticed. That's Kato Briggs. Samuel paused. Be careful with him. Corbin turned to study Samuel's face. Careful? Just careful. Samuel walked back toward the main house without elaborating. Corbin stood alone in the yard, watching the workers settle into their labor. The morning heat built steadily. Flies gathered around Reuben's body. 2 men would come later to remove it. That was how these things worked. He focused on the tall man, Kato, working in the far section of the field. Even from a distance, his movements stood out. Efficient, powerful. While others bent and straightened in steady rhythms, Kato seemed to flow through the work. By midday, Corbin had positioned himself near the cotton press to observe the field operations. Workers brought their filled sacks in steady streams, emptying them into the weighing station before returning to the rows. Kato approached carrying a bale that should have required 2 men. The bundle sat balanced on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. His breathing remained steady, not a single bead of sweat on his face. He set the bale down gently despite its mass, turned, walked back toward the field without once looking in Corbin's direction. Corbin's hand drifted to his pistol without conscious thought. He stopped himself, watched Kato's retreating form disappear into the white sea of cotton plants. The display of strength should have been irrelevant. Physical power meant nothing when facing a gun. But something about the ease of it, the absolute control, settled into Corbin's chest, like a stone. The afternoon heat pressed down heavy and thick as Corbin climbed the steps to the main house's back porch. Samuel sat in a wicker chair, a plate of cold chicken and bread on the small table beside him. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Join me, Mr. Hale." "You should eat." Corbin settled into the seat, accepting the plate a house servant brought him. The shade helped, but the air remained stifling. He ate in silence for several minutes, chewing methodically while his mind replayed the morning's events. The killing had gone exactly as planned. The workers' reaction had not. "You're thinking about Kato," Samuel said quietly. Corbin looked up. "I'm thinking about control." "Same thing, on this plantation." Samuel set down his fork. "I told you to be careful. You didn't ask why. I don't put stock in ghost stories. This isn't a ghost story." Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping despite the empty porch. "Kato Briggs has been at Stonemarch for 8 years. In that time, we've employed 7 overseers before you. 5 of them left specifically because of him." Corbin took a drink of water, keeping his expression neutral. "If he's violent, why wasn't he dealt with? That's just it. He's never been violent, never raised a hand, never disobeyed a direct order. On paper, he's the perfect worker, productive, quiet, respectful." Samuel's fingers drummed against the armrest. But every overseer who tried to break him ended up broken instead. Ended up how? Samuel's gaze drifted to the fields visible beyond the porch railing. 3 years ago, we had a man named Pritchard. Big fellow, former military. He believed in harsh discipline, same as you. When he saw how the other workers deferred to Kato, he decided to make an example. Took Kato to the whipping post one morning. Had him tied up proper, shirt off, ready to receive 20 lashes. Corbin waited. Pritchard raised the whip, brought it down, but somehow, no one quite saw how, the whip wrapped around his own wrist instead of hitting Kato's back. Dislocated Pritchard's shoulder. The man screamed like he'd been shot. Samuel's voice remained eerily calm. Kato was still tied to the post, hadn't moved an inch, couldn't have moved, but Pritchard quit that same day. Wouldn't even stay the night. Said he felt watched every second he stood near Kato. "Coincidence," Corbin said. "A man fumbled his whip." "Perhaps." Samuel picked up his fork again, but didn't eat. Then there was Dawson. Lasted 4 months. He tried a different approach. Isolation. Locked Kato in the root cellar for 3 days without food or water. When he went to let him out, he found the door already open. The lock was still engaged, mind you, still bolted from the outside, but the door stood wide, and Kato was sitting in the yard, calm as Sunday morning. Corbin's jaw tightened. Someone let him out. Who? Every enslaved person was accounted for in the fields. The house staff never left the main building. My brother was in Jackson on business. I was supervising the cotton press. Samuel finally met Corbin's eyes. Dawson packed his things and left without collecting his final wages. Said he wasn't interested in working a plantation where the devil walked free. The words settled over the porch like humidity. Corbin set down his plate, appetite fading. "You're telling me you believe Kato has some kind of power." "I'm telling you that accidents happen around him. Strange accidents. Convenient accidents. Always when someone pushes too hard." Samuel stood, brushing crumbs from his vest. "I'm telling you that Kato has never initiated a single act of rebellion, but 5 experienced overseers couldn't maintain authority once they tried to dominate him. Make of that what you will." Corbin watched Samuel walk back into the house, leaving him alone with the sound of cicadas and distant field songs. Superstition, that's all it was. Frightened men looking for explanations when simple incompetence would suffice. He rose and descended the porch steps, heading toward the fields to assess the afternoon's work. The cotton stretched in endless white rows, workers moving among them like dark water flowing through channels. Corbin positioned himself near the center section and watched. Within minutes, he noticed the pattern Samuel had hinted at. When a young woman struggled to reach a high cotton boll, she glanced toward where Kato worked 3 rows over. He gave the smallest nod, barely a tilt of his head. She moved to a different section of her row where the bolls hung lower. When two men began to argue over whose turn it was to haul the next full sack, Kato made a simple gesture with his left hand. They both stopped talking. One picked up the sack. The other returned to picking. No words exchanged. Corbin's irritation grew sharp and hot. He strode to the nearest group of workers. "You! Fill your sack faster. You're falling behind." The elderly man he addressed nodded. "Yes, sir." But his hands maintained the same steady pace. Corbin moved to another worker. "You need to reach higher. You're missing half the cotton." "Yes, sir." The woman's movements didn't change. Frustration built in Corbin's chest. He opened his mouth to issue another command when Kato's voice carried across the rows. Low, barely audible but somehow clear. "Reach higher now. Get the top bowls before sundown." Every worker within earshot immediately adjusted their technique, stretching to gather the cotton Corbin had just told them to pick. Their efficiency doubled in seconds. Corbin's hands clenched into fists. He crossed the distance to Kato's row in 6 long strides. The other workers seemed to sense the confrontation and melted away, creating a pocket of empty space around them. "Why do they listen to you?" Corbin demanded. Kato continued picking cotton, his large hands moving with careful precision. He didn't look up. "They listen to the work, sir. They listen to you. I give an order, and they ignore it. You say the same thing, and they obey." Corbin stepped closer. "Why?" Kato finally paused. He straightened slowly, his full height becoming apparent. He stood at least 3 inches taller than Corbin, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun, but his expression remained neutral, calm, almost gentle. "People follow the one who listens," Kato said simply. The words made no sense. Corbin stared at him, searching for mockery or challenge in his face. He found neither. Just a quiet, patient gaze that seemed to look through him rather than at him. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have, sir." Kato returned to picking cotton, his movements steady and unhurried. Corbin stood frozen in the row, fury building in his throat. This was defiance. It had to be. The calm tone, the simple words, the refusal to show fear. All of it was defiance, wrapped in a mask of humility. But he couldn't name a single rule Kato had broken. Couldn't identify a specific act of rebellion. The man had answered his question respectfully, called him sir, and returned to work without being dismissed. There was nothing to punish, and somehow that made it worse. Corbin turned and walked back toward the overseer's quarters, his boots heavy in the dirt. The sun had begun its descent toward the western tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Workers would labor another 2 hours before the bell rang for supper. Inside his small room, Corbin sat on the edge of the bed and removed his hat. The walls felt close. The air felt thick. Samuel's warnings circled through his mind like vultures. Every overseer who tried to break him left severely shaken. Accidents happen around him. People follow the one who listens. Corbin had built his reputation on fear. Fear was simple. Fear was measurable. You applied violence, and people submitted. That was how the world worked. But Kato didn't submit. Worse, he didn't resist. He existed in some space between that Corbin couldn't define. A moral presence that commanded authority without demanding it, that inspired loyalty without requiring it. For the first time in 17 years, Corbin felt uncertain. He stood and moved to the window, watching the distant fields where Kato's silhouette remained visible among the cotton plants. The man worked with the same steady rhythm, untouched by their conversation, undisturbed by the morning's killing. Corbin's hand drifted to his pistol again. The weight of it usually brought comfort. Tonight, it felt inadequate. Dawn broke cold and gray across Stone March Plantation. Corbin stood at the eastern fence line with a clipboard tucked under one arm, inspecting posts that had loosened during the previous week's storm. The morning air carried the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke from the cookhouse. Workers moved through the fields in the half-light, their shapes indistinct and ghostly. He made notes about 3 damaged sections that needed immediate repair. The clipboard gave his hands something to do besides drift toward his pistol. He'd slept poorly. Images of Kato's calm face had interrupted his rest repeatedly, along with Samuel's warnings about accidents and broken overseers. Footsteps approached from behind. Uneven, heavy, angry. "You got some nerve." Corbin turned. Eli Ward stumbled toward him, morning whiskey already thick on his breath. The farmhand's face was flushed red, his jaw set at a hostile angle. Eli worked the outer fields and handled equipment maintenance, a white man of low station who resented taking orders from anyone. "You got a complaint, Ward?" Corbin kept his voice level. "Damn right I got a complaint." Eli stopped 5 feet away, swaying slightly. "You cut my tobacco ration last night. Said I was taking more than my share." "You were taking more than your share. I counted the stores myself. That tobacco's part of my wages." Eli's hand moved to his belt, where a pistol hung in a worn holster. "You can't just decide what I get and don't get. You ain't been here but 2 days." Corbin set the clipboard against a fence post. "The owner sets rations. I enforce them. You want to argue? Take it up with Charles Whitlock." "Charles ain't here. He's in Vicksburg till next week." Eli's fingers brushed the pistol grip. "Which means you're making decisions you got no right to make." The morning seemed to grow quieter. Birds stopped singing. Even the distant sounds of workers in the fields faded to nothing. Corbin assessed the distance between them and calculated whether he could draw his own weapon before Eli completed the motion. "You're drunk," Corbin said. "Go sleep it off. I'm sober enough to shoot straight." Eli pulled the pistol free, his hand shaking but his intent clear. "Sober enough to put a hole in you for thinking you can come here and treat white men like slaves." Corbin's pulse quickened. He'd been threatened before. Dozens of times. But those threats usually came with warning. Time to prepare. This felt different. Eli's eyes held the glassy certainty of a man past reasoning, past fear, committed to violence for no reason beyond wounded pride. "Put the weapon down, Ward." "No, sir." Eli raised the pistol, his arm extending. "I don't think I will." Time seemed to slow. Corbin saw Eli's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the barrel align with his chest, saw the hammer begin its backward pull. Then a massive hand closed around Corbin's shoulder and yanked him sideways with shocking force. The gunshot cracked through the morning like breaking wood. Corbin hit the ground hard, shoulder slamming into dirt. The breath knocked from his lungs. Wood splintered above him. He rolled and looked up to see Kato Briggs standing where he'd been a moment before, one hand still extended from the pull. Eli stared at his pistol in confusion, as though surprised it had actually fired. The bullet had struck a fence post directly behind where Corbin's head had been, splitting the wood from top to bottom. Workers appeared from nowhere, 2 men who'd been repairing a nearby water trough. They moved toward Eli with synchronized precision, not aggressive, but purposeful. But Kato stepped forward first, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "Give me the gun, Mr. Ward," Kato said quietly. Eli swung the pistol toward him. "Get back, boy. This ain't your concern." "The gun, please." Kato extended his hand, palm up. "I'll shoot you. I swear I will." Kato took another step closer. His face remained absolutely calm, his voice gentle. "You won't shoot me, Mr. Ward. You're angry, but you're not a killer." "The hell I'm not." But Eli's hand trembled harder now, the barrel wavering. "You're a man who's been hurt by this place, same as anyone else." Kato moved within arm's reach. "You're a man who deserves better than this moment, better than what happens if you pull that trigger again." Eli's face crumpled. Something in his expression shifted from rage to confusion to sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. His arm dropped slowly. Kato gently took the pistol from his slack fingers. Footsteps pounded across the yard. Samuel appeared with 2 house guards, both carrying rifles. Samuel's face had gone pale, his eyes moving rapidly between Eli, Kato, and Corbin, still sprawled in the dirt. What in God's name happened here? Corbin pushed himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his jacket. His hands shook despite his efforts to control them. Ward tried to shoot me. Kato stopped him. Samuel's gaze locked on the splintered fence post. The bullet hole sat precisely at head height. His throat worked as he swallowed. Jesus Christ! The guards moved forward and took Eli by both arms. The farmhand didn't resist. He seemed to have deflated entirely, all the fight draining out of him the moment he'd surrendered the weapon. They led him toward the main house, his feet dragging in the dirt. Samuel approached Corbin, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you'd been killed, Charles would have burned this plantation down looking for someone to blame. There would have been investigations, lawyers. The state would have gotten involved. His eyes flicked toward Kato, who stood several feet away holding Eli's pistol loosely. Kato may have prevented more than just your death. Corbin nodded, unable to speak. His chest felt tight. The reality of how close he'd come to dying settled over him like cold water. Another second. A fraction of a second. That's all it would have taken. Samuel gestured to the guards. Lock Ward in the storehouse until Charles returns. We'll let him decide what to do with the fool. He turned back to Corbin. You should rest. You look half dead already. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're in shock. Samuel squeezed his shoulder. Rest. I'll handle the morning work assignments. Corbin watched Samuel walk away, leaving him alone with Kato and the two workers who'd appeared from the trough repair. Kato handed the pistol to one of them. Take this to Mr. Samuel. Tell him it needs to be stored somewhere secure. The worker nodded and left immediately, the other following close behind. Kato turned to face Corbin directly. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Corbin stared at the person who should have been his enemy, who by all logic should have let him die. His reputation was built on being the man who killed more than 70 enslaved people. If anyone had reason to watch him bleed out in the dirt, it was Kato. Why? Corbin's voice came out rougher than intended. Kato's expression didn't change. Why what, sir? Why save me? You know what I've done? Who I am. Corbin took a step closer. You could have let him shoot. No one would have blamed you. You were just working nearby. How could you have stopped it? I could have, Kato said simply. So I did. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now. Kato's eyes held that same unsettling quality, looking through Corbin rather than at him. Sometimes we save the moment, not the man. We preserve a choice that hasn't been made yet. Corbin shook his head. What choice? What are you talking about? The choice of what you become after this moment. After being saved by someone you consider beneath you. After standing at the edge of death and stepping back. Kato's voice remained gentle, almost kind. There are paths in front of you now that weren't there yesterday, Mr. Hale. Which one you walk is not my decision to make. The words made Corbin's head ache. He wanted simple answers, clear motivations. But Kato spoke in riddles wrapped in philosophy, challenging him to think in ways he'd never been forced to think before. I don't understand you. I know. Kato turned toward the fields where the other workers had resumed their tasks. But you will, sir. In time. He walked away with that same steady, unhurried pace. Corbin watched him go, feeling more unsettled than he had after the shooting itself. The near-death experience had been terrifying but comprehensible. This quiet insistence that Corbin was somehow more than what he'd always been, this was far more disturbing. Corbin spent the afternoon near the cotton press, ostensibly supervising but mostly watching Kato work from a distance. The man moved through his tasks with mechanical efficiency, never rushing, never slowing. When other workers approached him with questions, he listened with complete attention before offering brief guidance. His presence seemed to organize the chaos of plantation labor into something almost graceful. An idea began forming in Corbin's mind. What if he could leverage this influence? What if instead of fighting Cato's natural authority, he worked alongside it? The plantation could run more smoothly. Production could increase. Violence could decrease. Charles Whitlock would be pleased. Corbin's reputation would grow not just as an enforcer, but as a manager. The sun began its descent toward the tree line, painting the fields in amber light. Workers moved toward the bell that would signal the end of the day's labor. Corbin left the cotton press and walked directly to where Kato gathered tools for storage. "I wanted to thank you," Corbin said, without preamble, "for this morning. You saved my life." Kato set down a shovel and straightened. His face remained neutral. "You're welcome, Mr. Hale. I've been thinking about what you said, about choices and paths." Corbin shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of this conversation. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there are different ways forward here. Maybe. I'd like to." Corbin paused, searching for the right words. "I'd like to understand how you maintain order among the workers, how they listen to you. It's different from anything I've seen before." Kato looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite sadness, not quite pity, something deeper and more complex. "I saved a moment, Mr. Hale. Not a man." His voice carried the same gentleness it always did, but underneath lay something harder. "The paths I spoke of, you haven't chosen any of them yet. You're still standing at the crossroads, looking down roads you don't fully see. I don't understand. You will." Kato picked up the shovel again. "Or you won't. But understanding takes time, and time reveals truth that words cannot." He walked toward the tool shed, leaving Corbin standing alone in the fading light. Frustration and gratitude warred in Corbin's chest. He'd been saved by a man he should dominate, thanked someone he should terrify, and received wisdom he couldn't comprehend. Night fell across Stone March Plantation. Corbin lay in his quarters, staring at the ceiling while shadows moved across the wooden beams. The day replayed endlessly in his mind. Eli's pistol, Cato's intervention, those strange words about choices and paths. "I saved a moment, not a man." What did that mean? How could someone save a moment? Moments passed. They existed and disappeared. But men were solid, real. Saving a man meant pulling him from death's path. That's what Kato had done. Except Kato insisted otherwise. He spoke as though Corbin's life was less important than some abstract possibility, as though the person Corbin was mattered less than the person he might become. Corbin turned onto his side, pulling the thin blanket higher. The room felt too warm despite the cool night air. His skin prickled with uncomfortable awareness. Kato spoke to him like someone who understood him, really understood him. Not his reputation, or his violence, or his authority. Something underneath all that. Something Corbin himself didn't fully recognize, and that was more terrifying than any pistol pointed at his chest. The sun rose over Stone March Plantation like it always did, indifferent to the lives beneath it. Corbin stood beside the well, watching 3 workers distribute water barrels to the field crews. His arms crossed over his chest. His posture radiated the same authority it always had. But something had changed. Something small and subtle that he refused to name. When a worker struggled with a particularly heavy barrel, Corbin's first instinct was to bark an order. His mouth opened. The words formed on his tongue. Then he glanced toward where Kato stood near the cotton press, adjusting harness straps on a mule. Kato didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the struggling worker. Yet somehow, another worker moved to help before Corbin could speak. The barrel was lifted. The crisis resolved itself. Corbin closed his mouth and tried to convince himself he'd been about to let them handle it anyway. This happened 3 more times before the morning was half finished. A dispute over field assignments, a question about damaged equipment, a request to relocate barrels to different areas. Each time, Corbin found himself waiting, just a fraction of a second, to see how Kato would respond. And each time, the situation resolved smoothly without Corbin's intervention. The workers noticed. He could see it in their faces. The way they looked at him had shifted from fear to something more complex. Evaluation, maybe. Assessment. As though they were measuring whether his presence helped or hindered the natural order that Kato created. It made Corbin's jaw tight with frustration he couldn't quite articulate. By mid-morning, Samuel approached him near the tobacco barn. "Charles wants to see you." Now. Corbin followed Samuel to the main house, climbing the wide stairs to the second-floor study, where Charles Whitlock conducted plantation business. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Account books lined the shelves. A large desk dominated the center, covered with ledgers and correspondence. Charles sat behind the desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was a lean man in his late 40s, with sharp features and eyes that calculated profit with the same ease other men breathed. He didn't invite Corbin to sit. Cotton output dropped 4% this week. Charles tapped one of the ledgers. 4% may seem small, but over a season, it represents significant loss. "Explain." Corbin kept his voice steady. "Adjustment period, sir. The workers were producing higher yields under the previous overseer, despite his obvious weaknesses." Charles leaned forward. "I hired you because your reputation suggested you could maintain order. So far, I've seen one dead worker and declining productivity. That is the opposite of what I paid for. Sir, establishing proper discipline takes 1 week. Maybe 2, if the workers are particularly stubborn." Charles stood, walking around the desk to face Corbin directly. "You've been here 5 days. The workers should be terrified. Instead, they seem comfortable, almost relaxed. That suggests your methods are not working." Corbin felt heat rise in his chest. "I killed a man on the first day, in front of everyone." "Yes, and they mourned him for approximately an hour before returning to normal routine." Charles's expression hardened. "Fear without follow-through is just theater, Mr. Hale. I need results. If you cannot provide them, I will find someone who can." The threat hung in the air between them. Corbin had heard similar warnings before, though usually directed at others. Hearing it applied to himself created a nauseating twist in his stomach. "Understood, sir." "Good." Charles returned to his desk. "I expect production to increase by week's end." Dismissed. Corbin left the study with his hands clenched into fists. The pressure settled on his shoulders like physical weight. He needed to reassert control. Needed to remind everyone, workers and owner alike, that he was the authority here. Lunch passed in tense silence. Corbin ate alone in his quarters, staring at the wall and trying to formulate a plan. Every strategy he considered felt inadequate. Increase punishment? The workers already seemed immune to fear. Decrease rations? That would only lower productivity further. Public examples? He'd already tried that with Reuben, and it had accomplished nothing. The problem wasn't the methods. The problem was Kato. Corbin left his quarters immediately after finishing his meal. He found Kato at the tool shed, organizing equipment for afternoon repairs. 2 other workers sorted through various implements nearby, but they left as soon as Corbin approached. "We need to talk," Corbin said. Kato set down a hammer. "Yes, sir. Last night, what you said about saving a moment instead of a man, about paths and choices." Corbin stepped closer. "Stop speaking in riddles. Tell me plainly what you meant." Kato's expression remained calm, patient. "I meant exactly what I said, Mr. Hale. I preserved a moment in time, a crossroads. The man standing there, you, will make a choice, eventually. That choice will determine many things." "What choice?" "What are you talking about?" "The choice of who you become when the system you serve begins to devour you instead of the people beneath you." Kato's voice carried no anger, no accusation, just simple observation. Mr. Whitlock threatened you today. You can feel his willingness to discard you. That feeling, that fear of being disposable, that's new for you. Corbin felt his breath catch. How did you... Your posture when you left the main house, the tightness in your shoulders, the way you've been walking the grounds, looking for something to control. Kato tilted his head slightly. You're realizing that the terror you've inflicted on others can be inflicted on you just as easily. That your value is measured only in your usefulness. When you stop being useful, you become expendable. The accuracy of Kato's assessment made Corbin's skin prickle. You don't know anything about me. I know what I see. And I see a man beginning to understand the machine he serves. Kato picked up the hammer again, turning it over in his hands. Here's something else you should know, Mr. Hale. I could have overpowered Eli Ward without your help. I'm stronger than he is, faster, despite what people assume. I could have disarmed him, restrained him, prevented the shooting entirely on my own. Corbin frowned. Then why didn't you? Because saving you was more important than saving myself from potential harm. Kato set the hammer down with precise care. You are the only overseer whose future actions matter. The others who came before you were already decided, already committed to paths they couldn't leave. But you're standing at a genuine crossroads. What you choose in the coming days will either destroy everyone here or free them. The words landed like physical blows. Corbin stepped back, his mind reeling. That's insane. I'm an overseer. My job is to... Your job is whatever you choose it to be. Kato's tone remained gentle, almost kind. The question isn't what Mr. Whitlock wants, or what your reputation demands. The question is what you want when you realize the system will eventually consume you, just like it consumes everyone else. Corbin wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the presumption, but the words died in his throat because underneath the anger lay something worse. Recognition. Kato was right. The fear Corbin saw in Charles Whitlock's eyes today wasn't respect. It was the same cold calculation Corbin himself had used when deciding which enslaved person to kill for maximum effect. He was a tool, replaceable, disposable. This conversation is over, Corbin said, his voice rough. Yes, sir. Kato returned to organizing tools as though nothing significant had occurred. Corbin walked away, his legs feeling unsteady. The afternoon sun beat down with oppressive heat. Workers moved through their tasks in the fields, and Corbin tried to supervise, tried to assert the authority he was supposed to have. But they weren't afraid of him. Not really. They watched him with that same evaluative gaze, measuring his actions against some standard only Kato fully understood. When Corbin ordered a crew to move irrigation equipment, they complied, but only after one worker glanced toward where Kato worked 2 rows over. When Corbin criticized the pace of cotton picking, the workers adjusted their speed, but their eyes tracked Kato's response more than Corbin's presence. He was orbiting. That was the word that kept surfacing in his mind. He was orbiting Kato's gravity, pretending to be the sun while actually circling something far more substantial. Dusk arrived with its usual golden light. The work bell rang, signaling the end of the day's labor. Corbin stood on the balcony of the overseer's house, watching the workers gather near the tool shed. Kato moved among them, coordinating the evening cleanup with quiet efficiency. No raised voice, no threats, just calm instruction that people followed because it made sense to follow it. Leadership. Real leadership. Not the kind enforced through terror, but the kind earned through understanding and consistency. Corbin gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles white. The truth settled over him like the descending darkness. Leadership on this plantation didn't belong to him. It never had. From the moment he'd arrived, he'd been operating in Kato's world, following rhythms Kato had established long before Corbin's first day. And every person here knew it, except him. The morning arrived heavy with humidity. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, their underbellies swollen with rain that would come before nightfall. Corbin stood outside the overseer's house, watching the sky and feeling the pressure in the air match the pressure in his chest. Today would be different. Today, he would remind everyone who held authority here. He strapped on his belt, checked his pistol, and walked toward the fields with deliberate purpose. Workers were already moving between rows, their hands working through cotton bolls with practiced efficiency. Corbin positioned himself at the field's edge, arms crossed, jaw set. "You there," he called to a young man near the front. "Work faster." The young man glanced up, nodded, and increased his pace slightly. But his eyes, they drifted left, toward where Kato worked 3 rows over. Just a flicker, a moment of checking. Corbin's hands tightened. "I said faster. Don't look away from your work." "Yes, sir." The young man picked up speed, but the damage was done. Corbin had seen the instinct, the automatic deference to someone who wasn't him. He moved down the line, calling out commands, corrections, criticism. Each time workers responded appropriately. They said, "Yes, sir," and adjusted their behavior. But almost every single one of them glanced toward Kato first. Not obviously, not in open defiance, just a subtle shift of the eyes, a quick assessment, as though checking whether Corbin's orders aligned with some deeper understanding only Kato provided. The embarrassment burned in Corbin's stomach. He was being measured, evaluated, found wanting, and everyone could see it happening. By mid-morning, the clouds had moved closer. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Corbin paced the yard between the fields and the main house, his mind working through increasingly desperate strategies. He needed something dramatic, something that would re-establish the natural order. His eyes landed on a massive oak timber lying near the equipment shed. It had been cut the previous week for eventual use in barn repairs, a solid piece of wood at least 20 feet long, and thick enough that it usually required 4 men and a cart to move. Perfect. Corbin walked to where Kato was repairing a fence section. Several other workers labored nearby, their attention subtly oriented toward Kato, even as they focused on their own tasks. "Kato!" Corbin called out. Kato set down his tools and approached. "Yes, sir?" "See that timber by the equipment shed?" "Yes, sir." "Move it to the south end of the yard. By yourself. I want it done within the hour." The nearby workers stopped moving. The request was impossible. Everyone knew it. 4 men could barely manage that timber with proper equipment. 1 man alone had no chance. Kato looked at Corbin for a long moment. His expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Then he nodded. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the timber without hesitation. Workers throughout the yard began to slow their own tasks, attention shifting toward the spectacle Corbin had created. This was it. This was the moment Kato would fail, and everyone would see that he was just a man. Strong, yes, but still bound by the same physical limitations as anyone else. Kato reached the timber and stood beside it, studying its length and weight. He crouched low, positioning his hands beneath the wood at its approximate center of balance. His shoulders settled. His breathing deepened. Then he lifted. The timber rose smoothly off the ground. Not quickly. The weight was obviously immense, but with steady, controlled power. Kato adjusted his grip, shifted the load across his shoulders, and began walking. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Corbin's mouth went dry. Workers throughout the yard had stopped entirely now, watching in silence as Kato carried the massive timber across the yard. His pace was measured but consistent. Sweat appeared on his forehead, his arms, but his expression remained calm, focused. Each footfall placed with precision, despite the incredible burden. He crossed the entire yard, set the timber down at the southern boundary, exactly where Corbin had specified. Then straightened, rolled his shoulders once, and walked back toward the fence he'd been repairing. The silence that followed felt deafening. Corbin stood frozen, his humiliation complete. He'd intended to prove Kato's limitations, Instead, he'd demonstrated the opposite, that Kato possessed strength and discipline far beyond what any ordinary man could claim. And worse, Kato had approached the impossible task without complaint, without argument, accepting Corbin's obvious attempt at humiliation with the same unshakable composure he brought to everything. Workers returned to their tasks, but Corbin saw it in their eyes, the quiet notation of power, the recognition that Corbin's authority was hollow, while Kato's capability was real. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering against the dry ground. Workers moved to secure tools and equipment as the storm approached. Hoofbeats sounded from the main road. Charles Whitlock rode into the yard on his black mare, his coat already darkening with rain. He dismounted and strode directly toward Corbin, his face tight with anger. "Walk with me," Charles commanded. They moved toward the barn's overhang, out of the rain's immediate path. Charles turned on Corbin with barely controlled fury. "I received a report this morning that workers are ignoring your instructions," Charles said. "That they're taking direction from one of the slaves instead of from their overseer." "Sir, that's an exaggeration." "Is it?" Charles stepped closer. "Because from where I'm standing, it appears you've completely lost control of this plantation. The workers don't fear you. They don't respect you. They barely acknowledge your authority. That's unacceptable." Rain drummed harder against the barn's metal roof. Corbin felt his future narrowing with each word Charles spoke. "I need time to—" "You've had time." Charles's voice cut like a blade. 6 days. That's more than sufficient to establish order. Instead, productivity continues to decline, and the slaves grow more comfortable every day. Do you understand what that suggests, Mr. Hale? "Sir, it suggests you are not the man I hired. It suggests your reputation was inflated, or that you've lost whatever edge made you effective." Charles's eyes held no sympathy. "An overseer who cannot maintain order will be replaced without hesitation. I don't care how many people you've killed on other plantations. If you can't control mine, you're worthless to me." The word worthless echoed in Corbin's mind. He'd used similar language countless times when evaluating enslaved workers. Hearing it applied to himself created a visceral reaction, shame mixed with rage, mixed with fear. "I'll fix this," Corbin said. "You have 3 days." Charles mounted his horse. 3 days to restore proper discipline. If production hasn't increased and the workers aren't properly terrified by then, you'll be dismissed. And Mr. Hale, when I dismiss someone, they don't receive references or compensation. They leave with nothing. Do I make myself clear? "Yes, sir." Charles rode away into the rain, leaving Corbin standing beneath the barn's overhang with water dripping from the roof's edge. 3 days. 72 hours to salvage his position, his livelihood, his entire identity as the man who could control any plantation through fear. But how? The old methods weren't working. Violence had failed. Humiliation had backfired. Every attempt to assert dominance only revealed how little power he actually possessed. Corbin walked slowly back to his quarters as the storm intensified. Rain soaked through his clothes, plastered his hair to his skull, ran in rivulets down his face. He barely noticed. Inside, he stripped off his wet garments and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. The rain pounded against the roof, a constant drumming that matched the chaos in his thoughts. Samuel's words from days earlier surfaced. Perhaps you could use Kato's influence, rather than fight against it. Corbin had dismissed the suggestion immediately. Working with an enslaved person? Ridiculous. Impossible. It violated every principle he'd operated under for his entire career. But what choice did he have now? "I need Kato," Corbin said aloud to the empty room. The admission felt like defeat, like acknowledging that everything he'd believed about power and control was fundamentally wrong, but it was also the truth. Without Cato's cooperation, Corbin had no path forward. Charles would dismiss him. He'd become another failed overseer, discarded and forgotten, disposable, just like the people he'd spent his life terrorizing. The afternoon dragged on with rain continuing to fall. Corbin sat in his quarters, turning over possibilities, considering approaches. Finally, as the storm began to ease, he walked to the tool shed where Kato was inventorying equipment after the weather delay. "I need to ask you something," Corbin said. Kato looked up from his clipboard. "Yes, sir." "How do you do it? How do you get them to cooperate without threats or punishment?" Corbin hated how desperate he sounded, but the question needed asking. "What's your method?" Kato set down the clipboard. His expression remained patient, almost gentle. "I listen." 2 words. That was the entire answer. "I listen." Fury erupted in Corbin's chest. "That's it? You listen? That's your grand strategy?" "Yes, sir." "That's not an answer." Corbin's voice rose. "I'm asking you seriously. How do you maintain their loyalty? What technique are you using?" "I listen to them," Kato repeated. "I hear what they need, what troubles them, what they hope for. I remember their names, their families, their concerns, and when I give instruction, it's based on understanding who they are as people." The simplicity of it felt like mockery, like Kato was deliberately avoiding a real explanation just to frustrate him. Corbin stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You're playing games with me." "No, sir. I'm telling you the truth." Kato's calm never wavered. "The difference between us isn't complexity. It's attention. You see workers, I see people." Corbin wanted to hit him, wanted to rage against the quiet certainty in Kato's voice. But beneath the anger lay something more unsettling, the suspicion that Kato was right. He turned and walked away without another word. Evening arrived with clearing skies and the smell of wet earth. Corbin sat in his quarters, listening to rain drip from the eave. His mind replayed every interaction, every failed attempt at control, every moment when workers had looked to Kato instead of him. I listen. Such a simple concept. But Corbin realized with growing horror that he'd never done it. Not once. Not to enslaved people, not to fellow overseers, not to the quiet voice in his own head that occasionally questioned the brutality he inflicted. He'd spent his entire life talking, commanding, threatening, punishing, never listening, never considering that the people around him had thoughts, needs, perspectives worth acknowledging. And that recognition, that he'd built his entire identity on ignoring the humanity of others, terrified him more than Charles Whitlock's threats ever could. Because if Kato was right, if listening was the foundation of real authority, then everything Corbin had believed about power was wrong, and he'd spent decades becoming very good at something utterly worthless. The rain stopped. Silence settled over the plantation. Corbin sat in the darkness of his quarters, afraid to light a lamp, afraid to face what this moment of clarity might demand of him next. Dawn broke with pale light filtering through dissipating clouds. The storm had left the fields transformed. Mud coated everything, turning the red Mississippi clay into a thick, treacherous surface that would make the day's work grueling. Corbin stood on the porch of his quarters, watching workers emerge from their cabins and begin the slow trudge toward the fields. He'd barely slept. The previous night's realization had churned through his mind relentlessly, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. But somewhere in those dark hours, he'd made a decision. If listening was the key, if working through Kato was the only path forward, then he would try it. Not out of any moral awakening, Corbin wasn't ready to examine that yet, but out of pure survival instinct. Charles Whitlock had given him 3 days. This was day 1. Corbin walked to the fields where workers were already gathering, their feet thick with mud. Kato stood near the equipment shed, distributing tools with his usual quiet efficiency. Corbin approached him directly, keeping his voice low enough that others wouldn't overhear. I need your help coordinating today's work, Corbin said. Kato turned, his expression neutral. Yes, sir. The fields are going to be difficult after the rain. We need to prioritize areas that drain better. Leave the low sections for later in the week. Corbin paused, forcing himself to add, What do you think? Something shifted in Kato's eyes. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The eastern section near the creek drains fastest. We could start there, move to the northern quarter by midday, when the sun's had time to dry things out. That makes sense, Corbin nodded. Can you organize the crews accordingly? Yes, sir. Corbin watched as Kato moved among the workers, speaking quietly to small groups. The response was immediate. People nodded, adjusted their tool selections, began moving toward the eastern fields without hesitation or complaint. It was coordination Corbin had never achieved through threats or violence. Simple, efficient cooperation born from trust. The morning progressed smoothly. Corbin walked the fields, observing rather than commanding. When he noticed a problem, a broken hoe, a worker struggling with a heavy load, he mentioned it to Kato, who addressed it promptly. The indirect method felt strange, almost cowardly, but it worked. By mid-morning, productivity had noticeably increased. Workers moved with purpose, their rhythm steady despite the challenging conditions. When Corbin passed, they acknowledged him respectfully, not with fear, but with something resembling acceptance. They weren't responding to him directly. They were responding to Kato's endorsement of the tasks Corbin had outlined. It was authority by proxy. And despite feeling somewhat diminished by the arrangement, Corbin found satisfaction in it. The work was getting done. Charles would see the results. Perhaps this was enough. Around noon, Corbin heard shouting near the water station. He walked quickly toward the commotion and found Thomas Whitlock, Charles's teenage son, gripping a young girl's arm roughly. The girl, maybe 14 years old, stood trembling while water from an overturned bucket pooled around her feet. "You spilled half the barrel." Thomas's voice cracked with adolescent fury. "That's deliberate waste." "It was an accident, sir," the girl whispered. "The handle slipped in the mud." "Don't lie to me." Thomas raised his free hand as if to strike her. Corbin stepped between them. "Let her go." Thomas turned, his face flushed. "This doesn't concern you. My father put me in charge of water distribution, and I'm in charge of discipline." Corbin kept his voice calm. "The ground's slick from the rain. The spill was accidental, not deliberate. There's no need for punishment. She needs to learn. She needs to get back to work." Corbin looked at the girl. "Go on." The girl pulled free from Thomas's loosened grip and ran. Thomas stared at Corbin with undisguised anger. "My father will hear about this," Thomas said. "I'm sure he will." Corbin met the boy's eyes steadily. "And when he does, I'll explain that I prevented you from punishing a worker for conditions created by weather, not negligence. Your father hired me to maintain order, not to enable cruelty for its own sake." Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then stalked away toward the main house. Corbin watched him go, feeling oddly calm. He'd intervened not out of compassion exactly, but out of logic. Punishing someone for an accident served no purpose except satisfying Thomas's need to feel powerful. It would have damaged morale and reduced productivity. When Corbin turned back toward the fields, he caught several workers watching. Their expressions held something new, cautious appreciation, perhaps even the beginnings of trust. They'd witnessed him protect one of their own from arbitrary violence. The implications would spread through the quarters by evening. Corbin returned to his rounds, unsettled by his own actions. He told himself it was strategic, nothing more. But the look in that girl's eyes, the gratitude mixed with disbelief, had affected him in ways he couldn't quite name. The afternoon continued with steady progress. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Corbin found Kato behind the barn, checking equipment that had been stored during the rain. "The day went well," Corbin said. "Yes, sir." Kato set down a coil of rope. "The eastern fields produced more than expected, because of your coordination." Corbin leaned against the barn wall. "This arrangement we have, it works. It could work." Kato's tone carried careful emphasis. "If it continues, what does that mean?" Kato was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "The plantation's oppression survives because overseers enforce rules without question. They punish not because punishment serves a purpose, but because cruelty is expected. Expected by owners, by society, by the system itself." Corbin listened, keeping his expression neutral. "But today," Kato continued, "you questioned that expectation. When Thomas wanted to punish that girl, you asked whether the punishment was deserved. You considered context, circumstances, logic. That's different. It made sense to intervene." "Yes, and that's what makes it significant." Kato met Corbin's eyes directly. "Most overseers never ask whether something makes sense. They only ask whether it maintains control. Your restraint today suggests the possibility of change." The word change hung in the air between them. Corbin wasn't certain what Kato meant by it. Change in the plantation's operations, or change in Corbin himself? Perhaps both. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," Corbin said. "I'm suggesting that you're capable of becoming something other than what you've been." Kato's voice held no judgment, only observation. "That the authority you've built on fear could be rebuilt on respect. It's a harder path, but a more stable one." Corbin absorbed this slowly. For the first time in his career, someone was offering him not criticism, but possibility. The idea that he could earn genuine respect, not through violence, but through fairness, appealed to something deep and long buried in his consciousness. He'd spent decades believing that fear was the only reliable foundation for power, that cruelty was necessary for control. But today had demonstrated otherwise. Workers had responded to reasonable coordination. They'd trusted him when he intervened against arbitrary punishment. The results spoke for themselves. Maybe Kato was right. Maybe there was another way. "I'll think about what you've said," Corbin told him. Kato nodded and returned to his work. Corbin walked slowly back toward his quarters as twilight settled over the plantation. The day's events replayed in his mind. The smooth coordination, the increased productivity, the moment he'd stepped between Thomas and that frightened girl. An unfamiliar sense of pride began to grow in his chest. Not the pride of domination he'd felt after killing or terrorizing, but something quieter and more substantial. The pride of having made decisions that actually improved conditions rather than just reinforcing his own authority. He believed, in that moment, that the worst of his nature had been subdued, that he'd found a path forward that didn't require the brutality that had defined his entire career. The partnership with Kato seemed solid, workable, even sustainable. Corbin reached his quarters as darkness completed its descent. He lit a lamp and sat at his small desk, feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time in years. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Charles Whitlock had spent the afternoon on the main house balcony, watching the fields through a brass telescope, watching Corbin coordinate through Kato, watching workers respond with cooperation rather than fear, watching his son's authority be undermined by an overseer who seemed more interested in efficiency than dominance, and Charles Whitlock was deeply, dangerously suspicious of what he'd seen. The dawn air held a damp chill that made Corbin's breath visible as he climbed the steps to the main house porch. He'd been summoned before breakfast, which rarely meant anything good. Charles Whitlock sat in a high-backed wicker chair, coffee steaming in a porcelain cup beside him. His posture radiated controlled hostility. "Sit down, Hale." Corbin took the chair opposite, keeping his expression neutral. Years of dealing with volatile plantation owners had taught him to reveal nothing until he understood the nature of the confrontation. Charles studied him in silence for a long moment. "There are rumors circulating. Troubling ones. What kind of rumors, sir? That you've gone soft. Charles's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. That you're coordinating fieldwork through one of the slaves, rather than issuing direct commands. That you intervened when my son attempted to discipline a worker for negligence. Corbin chose his words carefully. I've been working to improve productivity. The methods I've employed have increased output by... I don't care about your methods. Charles set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. I care about structure, order, the fundamental understanding that these people only obey through fear. Without that fear, everything collapses. With respect, sir, fear can reduce efficiency. Workers who cooperate because they understand the work produces better results than workers who cooperate only to avoid punishment. Charles's eyes narrowed. That's exactly the kind of thinking that destroys plantations. You're not here to make them understand anything. You're here to make them obey. There's a difference. I understand that, but do you? Charles leaned forward slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've allowed one slave to accumulate enough influence that workers follow his instructions rather than yours. That's not cooperation, Hale. That's subversion. Corbin felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady. Kato Briggs has natural leadership qualities. I've simply leveraged those qualities to maintain order more efficiently. You've empowered him. Charles's tone turned harder. You've given him authority he should never possess. And now the entire workforce looks to him instead of fearing you. That's not efficiency. That's weakness. The work is getting done. I didn't hire you to get work done through delegation. Charles stood abruptly. I hired you because you have a reputation for maintaining absolute control, for making examples that ensure obedience. Instead, you're consulting with slaves and second-guessing my son's disciplinary decisions. That's not the man I paid for. Corbin rose as well, fighting to keep frustration from his voice. I was trying to adapt to the specific conditions of this plantation. The workers here respond differently. They respond the same as workers everywhere. Charles's voice rose slightly. They respond to strength, to fear, to the knowledge that disobedience brings immediate consequences. You've forgotten that, or worse, you've chosen to ignore it. Either way, the result is the same. You're undermining the structure this plantation requires to function. Sir, if you'd give me time to demonstrate that these methods produce results, I've already given you time. And what I've observed is a workforce that operates through the influence of a single slave, rather than through proper overseer authority. That ends now. Charles moved toward the porch steps. I'm going to restore order personally. Watch and remember what real discipline looks like. Before Corbin could respond, Charles descended the steps and called for his horse. Within minutes, he was riding toward the eastern fields, leaving Corbin standing alone on the porch, with the unsettling certainty that something terrible was about to unfold. Corbin followed on foot, reaching the fields as Charles dismounted near the work crews. The plantation owner surveyed the scene with cold assessment. Workers moved efficiently, coordinating tasks with minimal wasted motion. Kato stood near the center, quietly directing traffic, pointing toward a wagon that needed unloading, nodding toward a section where weeds needed clearing. It was the kind of smooth operation any owner should appreciate. But Charles's expression darkened as he watched. You see that? Charles gestured toward Kato. That's what I'm talking about. Look how they orient themselves around him. Look how they wait for his signal before moving. He's not following your commands, Hale. You're following his. He's simply helping coordinate. He's controlling them. Charles's voice carried across the field, drawing workers' attention. This is exactly the kind of influence that leads to rebellion. One man positioning himself as their true leader, while the actual authority stands aside and watches. Corbin felt a wave of dread. That's not what's happening. He's just efficient at organizing labor, efficient at consolidating power. Charles remounted his horse, I want him at the main house within the hour. And I want you and Samuel there as well. This situation requires immediate correction." Charles rode off before Corbin could protest further. Workers had frozen in place, watching the exchange with barely concealed alarm. Kato stood motionless, his expression unreadable but his posture suggesting he understood exactly what was coming. Corbin walked back toward the main house with leaden steps, his mind racing through possible interventions and finding none that wouldn't put his own life at risk. By the time he reached the building, both Samuel and Charles were already inside. The meeting took place in Charles's study, a dark-paneled room dominated by a massive oak desk. Samuel stood near the window, looking uncomfortable. Corbin positioned himself near the door, still searching for arguments that might change what he already sensed was an inevitable decision. Charles wasted no time. "Kato Briggs will be executed at dawn tomorrow." The words hit Corbin like a physical blow. "Sir, that's necessary," Charles cut him off. "He's guilty of insubordination and manipulation. He's positioned himself as a rival authority structure, and that cannot be tolerated. His execution will remind every slave on this plantation what happens when someone tries to elevate themselves above their station. He hasn't done anything that warrants. He's done everything that warrants it." Charles's voice was final. "He's created a situation where workers obey him rather than you, where coordination flows through him rather than through proper channels. That's manipulation of the highest order, and it ends tomorrow morning." Corbin's mouth felt dry. There has to be another way to address this. "There isn't." Charles looked at Samuel. "Do you have any objections?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "I think perhaps a lesser punishment might." "I'm not interested in lesser punishments. I'm interested in restoring order." Charles returned his attention to Corbin. "And you, Hale, will be present at dawn to witness what real discipline looks like. Consider it a refresher course." Corbin stood frozen, unable to voice the protests screaming in his mind. To argue further would be to openly defy the plantation owner, which would likely result in his own execution alongside Kato's. But to remain silent felt like a betrayal of everything he'd started to become over the past few days. The meeting ended with Charles dismissing them both. Samuel left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Corbin followed him into the hall and caught his arm. "You can't let him do this." Samuel pulled free, glancing around nervously. "Keep your voice down. Charles is going to kill a man for the crime of being good at his job. You know that's wrong. I know that contradicting my brother gets people killed." Samuel's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "You think I agree with this decision? I don't. But I also don't have the authority or the courage to stop it. And neither do you, unless you want to join Kato in that shed. So we just let it happen? We survive." Samuel's expression was pained but resolute. "That's what we do. We survive by not making ourselves targets. I'm sorry, Hale. I truly am. But there's nothing either of us can do." Samuel walked away, leaving Corbin alone in the dim hallway. Through a window, he could see guards dragging Kato toward a small wooden shed used for isolating slaves before punishment. Kato didn't resist, didn't struggle. He walked with the same calm composure he always carried. Corbin waited until the guards locked the shed and departed, then approached quietly. The structure was crude, rough planks with gaps between them wide enough to see through. Inside, Kato sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall. "Kato." Kato looked up, his face visible through the slats. "Mr. Hale, I'm going to find a way to stop this." "No, you're not." There was no accusation in Kato's voice, only certainty. "Because any attempt to stop it would require you to risk everything you are, and you're not ready for that yet." Corbin pressed closer to the shed. "There has to be something." "There is." Kato's eyes reflected the fading sunlight. "There's the choice I saved for you, the one I knew would come eventually." "What choice? Whether the man you've been becoming these past days is real, Or just another mask you wear when it's convenient? Kato shifted slightly. Charles is going to kill me, because he's terrified of what happens when slaves stop fearing their overseers. He sees cooperation as weakness, efficiency as threat. He'd rather burn this plantation to the ground than allow workers to function through anything except terror. I can talk to him again. You can't. Cato's interruption was gentle but firm. Talking won't change his mind. He's already decided. The only question is what you decide. Two guards appeared from around the corner, motioning for Corbin to move away. He stepped back reluctantly, and they positioned themselves between him and the shed. One of them, a thick-shouldered man named Garrett, shook his head. Orders are no one talks to him. Mr. Whitlock's instructions. Corbin wanted to argue, but knew it would accomplish nothing. He walked away slowly, then stopped and turned back. Through the gaps in the shed's walls, he could see Kato watching him steadily. Their eyes met across the distance. Cato's voice carried just loud enough to reach him. "Now you face the choice I saved for you!" The guards shouted for Corbin to leave. He retreated toward his quarters, but couldn't bring himself to go inside. Instead, he circled back as night fell and sat on the ground outside the shed, just beyond the guard's sight line. His back against a fence post, hands trembling slightly. Every bit of trust he'd built over the past few days, with the workers, with Kato, with himself, would crumble if he did nothing. The man he'd started to become, the one who'd intervened to protect that girl from Thomas's arbitrary cruelty, who'd found satisfaction in coordinating rather than terrorizing, would die alongside Kato at dawn. But attempting to save Kato meant open rebellion. It meant turning against Charles Whitlock, against the entire structure of the plantation, possibly against the law itself. It meant risking everything. Corbin sat in the darkness, shaking, finally understanding the full weight of what Kato had been trying to tell him all along. There was no middle path, no way to be slightly better while remaining part of a system built entirely on oppression. The choice was absolute. Preserve himself by allowing Cato's execution, or become someone entirely different by trying to stop it. The night stretched on. Corbin didn't move, didn't sleep, just sat there trembling in the cold, staring at the shed where Kato waited calmly for whatever came next, understanding at last that he couldn't remain passive. Not anymore. The hours before dawn stretched endlessly. Corbin remained motionless against the fence post, his body stiff with cold, his mind cycling through 1,000 justifications for inaction. Each one collapsed under the weight of Cato's final words. "Now you face the choice I saved for you." The guards changed shifts at 4:30. Corbin watched through half-closed eyes as Garrett and his partner handed off to two younger men, Travis and Beck, both relatively new to Stone March. They settled into position with visible boredom, expecting nothing more than a quiet wait until execution time. Corbin stood slowly, every joint protesting. His legs had gone numb from sitting. He shook them out quietly, then walked toward the shed with deliberate casualty, as though merely stretching his legs before dawn. Travis straightened when he approached. "Mr. Hale, you're up early." "Couldn't sleep." Corbin kept his voice level. "Thought I'd check the restraints before Mr. Whitlock arrives. Make sure there are no complications." Beck glanced at his partner uncertainly. "We checked them an hour ago. Chains are solid." "I'm sure they are." Corbin maintained his authoritative tone. "But Charles is particular about these things. He'll ask me directly if I verified personally, and I'd prefer not to tell him I trusted someone else's assessment." The younger guards exchanged looks. Travis shrugged. "Want us to unlock it?" "Just one of you." "Beck, why don't you walk the perimeter? Make sure no one's gathering to watch early. Last thing we need is an audience before Charles is ready." Beck hesitated, then nodded and walked away. Travis produced a key and unlocked the shed door, swinging it open. Inside, Kato sat exactly as he'd been hours earlier, hands chained to an iron ring bolted into the wall. "Give me a moment," Corbin said. "I'll let you know if anything needs adjusting." Travis stepped back a few paces, giving him space. Corbin entered the shed and crouched beside Kato, examining the chains with exaggerated thoroughness. His hands shook slightly as he ran his fingers over the iron links. "I'm getting you out," he whispered, barely audible. Kato's expression didn't change. "I know. When I move, stay behind me." Kato nodded once. Corbin stood and walked back to the doorway. "Travis, come look at this connection point. Something feels loose." Travis approached without suspicion, leaning into the shed to see where Corbin pointed. In one fluid motion, Corbin grabbed the young guard's collar and drove his knee into Travis's midsection, then caught him as he doubled over and lowered him quietly to the ground. Travis gasped for air, but couldn't shout. Corbin found the keyring on Travis's belt and unlocked Kato's chains. They fell away with a soft, metallic sound. Kato stood, rubbing his wrists briefly, then helped Corbin drag Travis fully into the shed. "He'll wake in a few minutes," Corbin said, removing his own belt to secure Travis's hands behind his back. "We need to move now." They stepped outside. Beck was still making his perimeter walk, 30 yards away with his back turned. Corbin and Kato moved in the opposite direction, staying low and using the morning darkness as cover. "The workers," Corbin said quietly. "How many can we trust?" "Most of them." Kato's voice was steady. Fear kept them silent, not loyalty to the system. If they see a real chance to leave, they'll take it. "Where do we start?" "The family cabins nearest the east field. That's where the strongest networks are." They reached the first cabin within minutes. Kato knocked, 3 quick taps, then 2 slow ones. A woman opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw him unchained. "Gather everyone quietly," Kato said. "We're leaving. Now. Get the children ready and meet at the equipment barn in 10 minutes. She nodded and disappeared inside. Corbin heard urgent whispers as she woke others. They moved to the next cabin, then the next. Kato's instructions were the same each time. Gather families, avoid noise, meet at the barn. Workers responded with practiced efficiency, as though they'd prepared for this possibility their entire lives. By the time they reached the barn, 30 people had assembled in near-perfect silence. Children stood close to parents, eyes wide, but mouths pressed shut. Elderly workers leaned on younger ones for support. Everyone watched Kato with absolute focus. "We have maybe an hour before they discover what's happened," Kato said, his voice calm and clear. "That's enough time if we move smart. Stay together, help anyone who struggles, and don't stop until we're deep in the forest trails. There's a settlement 2 days north. People who've made this journey before. They'll help us." A middle-aged man raised his hand slightly. "What about the guards? Most are still asleep. The ones awake are scattered. We're not here to fight. We're here to disappear." Kato looked at Corbin. "Mr. Hale will delay anyone who tries to follow." Corbin felt dozens of eyes shift to him. He'd spent years being feared by people exactly like these. Now he stood beside them, complicit in their escape, fully aware of what that meant for his future. "There are weapons in the guard station," Corbin said, "but leave them. Armed runaways get hunted harder. Your best weapon is speed and numbers." Kato divided the group into smaller units. Families traveling together, stronger workers paired with elderly ones who needed assistance. He gave each unit a slightly different route through the plantation's eastern boundary, reducing the chance that all would be caught if guards intercepted one group. "What about you?" a young woman asked Kato. "I'll lead the largest group. We'll draw attention if any comes, giving the smaller units clean paths." He turned to Corbin. "You're staying?" "I have to." Corbin's throat felt tight. "If I disappear with you, they'll send every slave catcher in the state after all of us. But if I'm here when they wake up, I can give false directions, send search parties the wrong way. Buy you more time. They'll know you helped. Probably. Corbin managed a bitter smile. But I'll deny it long enough to matter. Kato studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Corbin shook it, feeling the rough calluses of decades of forced labor against his palm. The choice you made tonight, Kato said quietly. It's the one that defines everything that comes after. You understand that? Yes. Then you understand there's no going back to who you were. Corbin nodded. I don't want to go back. Kato released his hand and turned to the assembled workers. Move out. Quiet and quick. Trust the routes we discussed. And remember, we're not running from something. We're running toward freedom. Keep that in your hearts when the journey gets hard. The groups dispersed like smoke, each taking their assigned paths through the pre-dawn darkness. Corbin watched them go, counting silently to ensure everyone cleared the barn before he moved to the next phase of his plan. He walked quickly toward the guard station, a small building where off-duty guards stored extra weapons and kept shift schedules. Inside, he found the morning duty roster and altered several entries, creating confusion about who was supposed to be where. Then he moved weapons from their usual storage places, hiding rifles in grain barrels and relocating ammunition to the wrong shelves. By the time he finished, the sky had begun to lighten. He heard shouting from the direction of Kato's shed. Someone had found Travis. Corbin walked toward the commotion with forced casualness. Beck and another guard were helping Travis to his feet. Travis's face was red with rage and embarrassment. What happened? Corbin demanded, playing his role. Someone knocked me out, Travis gasped. The slave, Kato, he's gone. Corbin feigned shock. Gone? How is that possible? I don't know. Hale, you were the last one. I checked the chains and left. You were standing guard. Corbin turned to Beck. Did you see anyone approach after I walked away? Beck shook his head frantically. No, sir. I was doing perimeter like you asked. The main house doors burst open. Charles Whitlock stormed out in his nightclothes, his face purple with fury. What is this shouting? Sir, Corbin said before anyone else could speak, Kato Briggs has escaped. Someone attacked your guards during the night. Charles's eyes went wild. Escaped? How? We're still determining that. Corbin gestured toward the cabins. But we should secure the other slaves immediately. If he had help. Check the cabins! Now! Charles screamed at the gathering guards. And send riders to the boundaries. I want every road watched. Guards scattered to follow orders. Corbin positioned himself beside Charles, adopting the posture of a loyal subordinate awaiting instructions. This is impossible, Charles muttered, more to himself than anyone else. One man can't just disappear. He's still on the property. He has to be. Sir, Corbin said carefully, should I organize search parties? I know the plantation layout better than most. Charles grabbed his arm. Yes, take half the men and sweep north. I'll take the others south. He couldn't have gotten far on foot. Understood. Corbin started to turn away, then paused. Sir, what about the workers? Should we lock them in the cabins until we're certain Kato acted alone? Yes, do that first. Then begin the search. Corbin nodded and walked quickly toward the cabins. Guards were already pounding on doors, shouting for occupants to show themselves. But cabin after cabin stood empty. Families had vanished. Children's belongings remained scattered on floors. Cooking fires had gone cold. The magnitude of the escape became clear within minutes. Not one man, but dozens, entire families, gone into the dawn like water into sand. A guard ran to Charles with the news. Corbin watched from a distance as the plantation owner's face transformed from anger to something approaching terror. This wasn't simple escape. This was mass exodus, coordinated, planned. Charles turned slowly to look at Corbin, and in that moment, Corbin knew his deception had failed. The timing was too perfect, the efficiency too complete. Someone with authority had enabled this. Hale, Charles's voice was deadly quiet. Come here. Corbin walked forward, maintaining composure despite the fear rising in his chest. Around him, guards were discovering the extent of the loss. Nearly a third of the plantation's enslaved population had disappeared overnight. He'd bought Kato enough time. The escapees were beyond the eastern boundary by now, dispersed across multiple forest trails, following routes Kato had described with the certainty of someone who'd studied the landscape for years. Charles stood very still, watching Corbin approach. The sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty yard. "You knew," Charles said. Corbin met his gaze steadily. "Knew what, sir?" "Don't insult me." Charles's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt. "You helped them. You're the only one who could have." Corbin said nothing. Silence felt more honest than denial. "Where did they go?" "I don't know." "You're lying." "No, sir." Corbin's voice remained calm. "I genuinely don't know where they went." That was intentional. Charles drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Corbin's chest. "Then you're worthless to me." Charles's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound of running boots interrupted the moment. Beck appeared, breathless and pale. "Sir, the cabins, they're all empty. Not just Kato. Dozens are gone. Entire families." Charles's aim wavered. The pistol dipped slightly as his mind processed this information. "What?" "At least 30 people, sir. Maybe more. We're still counting." The plantation owner's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Disbelief, comprehension, and finally a rage so pure it seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He turned back to Corbin with lethal focus. "You did this." Corbin kept his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. "I opened one door, sir. That's all." "Liar!" Charles struck him across the face with the pistol. Pain exploded through Corbin's cheekbone. He tasted blood, but didn't move. "You coordinated this. You planned it." "No, sir." Corbin's voice stayed level despite the throbbing in his skull. "I just let one man out of a shed. What happened after that was their doing, not mine." "Where did they go?" "I don't know." Charles raised the pistol again. "Tell me, or I'll shoot you where you stand. Then shoot me." "I still won't know where they went." Corbin met his eyes without flinching. "They didn't tell me their route. They didn't need to." More guards arrived, each delivering the same grim news. The escape was massive, coordinated, recent enough that tracks were still visible heading away from the cabins, but the trails split and diverged so many times that no clear direction emerged. Charles lowered the weapon, his tactical mind overriding his fury for a moment. He couldn't afford to kill Corbin yet, not until he extracted every possible piece of information. "Beck, take him to the equipment shed and secure him. Travis, gather every available man. I want search parties on horseback within 10 minutes. Hands grabbed Corbin roughly. Beck and another guard forced his arms behind his back, binding his wrists with rope that bit into skin. They marched him across the yard while Charles shouted orders to the gathering men. Inside the equipment shed, they threw Corbin against the far wall. His shoulder struck wood hard enough to send fresh pain down his arm. Beck tied his bound wrists to an iron ring mounted in the wall, leaving him in an awkward half-sitting position. "You've lost your mind," Beck muttered. "Helping them? You know what they'll do to you?" "Yes." Beck stared at him, with something approaching pity. Was it worth it? Corbin thought of Kato leading those families through the darkness. Children who would grow up free. People who would never again feel the weight of chains. "Ask me again tomorrow." Beck left without responding, locking the shed door behind him. Through gaps in the wall boards, Corbin could see and hear the chaos unfolding. Charles stood in the yard surrounded by mounted men, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "They can't have gone far on foot. Spread out in all directions. Check roads, check river crossings, check every barn and hiding place within 5 miles. He paused, scanning the assembled riders. "And I want the one called Kato brought back alive." The rest can be shot if they resist. The riders prepared to depart. This was the critical moment. If they spread out efficiently, they might intercept at least some of the smaller groups. Corbin had to act now. "Sir!" he called out through the wall gaps. "Sir, I need to speak with you!" Charles turned toward the shed. Fury still etched across his features. He strode over and yanked the door open. "You have nothing I want to hear." "I saw which way they went," Corbin said quickly. "When I opened the shed, I saw them running." Charles grabbed him by the collar. "Tell me." "West toward the river. They were heading for the water." Corbin kept his voice urgent, desperate. "I heard them say something about boats, crossing to the other side." It was a complete lie. Kato had taken them east into the forest. But the river was a logical escape route, one that Charles would find believable. Charles studied his face, searching for deception. Corbin held his gaze, letting fear and exhaustion show. After a moment, the plantation owner released him and stepped back into the yard. "Change of plans!" Charles shouted to the riders. "Concentrate the search west. They're heading for the river. I want boats checked, ferries watched, and every crossing point covered." The riders wheeled their horses and galloped toward the western boundary. Dust rose in their wake, obscuring the morning sun. Within minutes, the yard stood nearly empty, except for a handful of guards left to watch the main house and oversee Corbin. Corbin slumped against the wall, allowing himself a moment of relief. The misdirection would buy Kato several more hours at minimum, possibly an entire day if the search parties wasted time combing the riverbanks. The shed door opened again. Samuel Whitlock stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. The plantation owner's brother looked shaken, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible distress. "They're saying you helped them escape," Samuel said softly. "They're saying the truth." Samuel pulled a stool close and sat down, studying Corbin with an expression that mixed confusion and something resembling respect. "Why? You've spent your entire career enforcing this system. You've killed more slaves than most men have owned. What changed?" Corbin's throat felt dry. Speaking required effort, with his injured face swelling. "Kato changed it." "How?" "He made me see what I'd become." Corbin shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure on his bound arms. "Every plantation I worked, I told myself I was just doing a job, following orders, maintaining discipline. I never thought about what that meant, what it made me." "And Kato showed you?" "He didn't show me anything I didn't already know. He just made me stop pretending I didn't know it." Corbin met Samuel's eyes. "You've lived here your whole life. You've watched this system destroy people. You know it's wrong, but you keep your head down because speaking up costs too much." Samuel flinched. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Corbin's voice carried no accusation, only exhaustion. "Kato asked me what kind of man I wanted to be. Not what kind of overseer, not what kind of employee, what kind of man. And I realized I'd spent decades avoiding that question because the answer was too ugly." "So you threw away your life to help people you've spent years brutalizing?" "I threw away the life of someone I don't want to be anymore." Corbin leaned his head back against the wall. "Maybe that doesn't make sense to you. Maybe it doesn't even make sense to me. But when Charles ordered Kato's execution, I knew I couldn't watch another person die because I was too afraid to act." Samuel stood slowly, pacing the small space. "Charles will kill you. You understand that? Tomorrow. Maybe the day after. But he'll kill you." "I know." "And you're at peace with that?" Corbin considered the question honestly. "No, I'm terrified. But I'm less terrified of dying than of continuing to live as what I was." Samuel moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're braver than I could ever be. Or stupider. Maybe both." Samuel opened the door. "I'll try to convince Charles to show mercy. But my brother—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "He doesn't forgive betrayal." "I'm not asking for forgiveness." Samuel left without responding. The door closed, leaving Corbin alone with the sound of his own breathing and the distant shouts of guards organizing the remaining workers who hadn't escaped. The settlement emerged from morning mist like a promise kept. 3 weeks had passed since the escape, and what began as desperate refugees huddled beneath makeshift shelters had transformed into something resembling permanence. Lean-to structures gave way to proper cabins. Scattered families became organized households. Fear slowly released its grip as cooperation took root. Kato walked the central pathway between dwellings, observing the community's rhythm with quiet satisfaction. Children ran past carrying buckets from the spring, their laughter a sound he hadn't heard in years. A young girl splashed her brother playfully, earning a scolding from their mother that held affection rather than terror. These small moments carried more weight than any grand declaration of freedom. Near the eastern edge of camp, 3 women wove baskets from river reeds. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating containers for storage and trade. One woman hummed softly, a melody Kato recognized from the plantation, but stripped now of its coded warnings. Here it was simply music. "Morning, Kato," the eldest weaver called out. Her name was Ruth, and she had lost 2 children to the plantation's brutality before the escape. "We'll have enough baskets finished by tomorrow to send with the trading party." "Good work." Kato paused beside them. "The settlement near Cypress Creek will need containers for their harvest." "You think they'll trust us?" another woman asked. "We're still new to freedom. They've been hiding for years." "They'll trust us because we understand what they've survived." Kato gestured toward the children playing nearby. "And because we bring families, not just soldiers." Further into camp, young men constructed a perimeter of sharpened stakes and observation posts. The defenses weren't meant to withstand a prolonged assault. That would be impossible against organized forces. Instead, they provided early warning and psychological comfort. People slept better knowing someone watched the approaches. Marcus, who had worked the cotton fields alongside Kato, supervised the construction with careful attention. He spotted Kato and called out, "We're nearly finished with the south side. Should be complete before nightfall." "Don't rush it," Kato replied. "Better to build it right than build it fast." Marcus nodded, returning to his work. The young man had changed significantly in 3 weeks. On the plantation, fear kept him hunched and silent. Here, responsibility straightened his spine. Leadership emerged when survival no longer consumed all energy. By mid-afternoon, word spread through camp that Kato would speak at the central fire pit. Gatherings like this had become tradition, moments when the community came together to share stories, make decisions, and remember why they fought for freedom. People assembled slowly as the sun lowered toward the western tree line. Families sat together on logs arranged in concentric circles. Elders claimed positions closest to the fire. Children settled at their parents' feet, unusually quiet with anticipation. Kato stood when the last stragglers arrived. He didn't raise his voice or demand attention. The simple act of standing brought silence. 3 weeks ago, he began, we walked away from Stone March Plantation. Some of you had lived there your entire lives. Some arrived recently, thinking you'd found your final resting place. All of you believed freedom was something whispered about, but never achieved. Heads nodded throughout the circle. A few people wiped tears, remembering the night they fled through darkness with nothing but hope and each other. I want to tell you how we got here, Kato continued. Not the walking part. You all remember that well enough. I mean how the door opened in the first place. He recounted the arrival of Corbin Hale, though he used no names. Details emerged carefully, painting a picture of a man shaped entirely by the system he enforced. Kato described the initial violence, the death of young Reuben, and the calculated brutality meant to establish dominance. This overseer had killed more than 70 people across multiple plantations, Kato said quietly. He believed fear was the only tool that mattered. He believed people like us existed only to serve people like him. And for many years, nothing challenged that belief. Ruth spoke up from her seat. What changed him? A choice. Kato let the words settle before continuing. When someone tried to kill him, I intervened. Not because I liked him. Not because I forgave his past. I intervened because I saw an opportunity. A crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Kato explained how Corbin's certainty began to fracture, the small moments of doubt, the questions that had no comfortable answers, the growing realization that the system he served had created him as surely as it created those he brutalized. He didn't become good, Kato clarified. Don't mistake my meaning. He'd done terrible things. He carried responsibility for suffering that can't be erased. But he reached a point where he had to decide. Would he continue being what the plantation made him? Or would he choose something different? Marcus raised his hand. And he chose to help us? He chose to stop being who he was. Cato's voice carried across the gathering. When they ordered my execution, he freed me knowing exactly what it would cost. He gave us time to escape by staying behind. He misdirected the search parties so we could reach safety, and he accepted punishment so we wouldn't be followed. An elderly man named Joseph stood slowly, his back bent with decades of forced labor, but his eyes remained sharp. Did he survive? Silence fell across the circle. Kato met Joseph's gaze directly. I don't know, he admitted. The last I saw him, he was preparing to face consequences. Whether Charles Whitlock showed mercy or cruelty, I cannot say. We left before dawn and never looked back. Should we have tried to help him? A young woman asked. No. Cato's response was firm but gentle. His choice was to give us freedom. Turning back would have dishonored that choice. His sacrifice bought time we desperately needed. Using that time to escape wasn't abandonment. It was completion of what he started. Joseph remained standing. Then we should honor his memory. Not his memory, Kato corrected. His choice. What he did matters more than who he was. And what matters most is understanding that even people shaped by terrible systems can choose differently when confronted with the weight of their actions. The community sat in contemplative silence. No one spoke for several minutes. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks toward the darkening sky. Finally, Ruth broke the quiet. We need to remember that. When we build our future, we need to remember that people can change. Systems break people, but people can also break free from systems. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Kato saw understanding settling into their faces. Not forgiveness for past cruelty, but recognition that justice required complexity. The world wasn't simply divided between good people and bad people. It was built from choices made under impossible pressure. As the gathering dispersed, families returned to their cabins. Children resumed playing. Evening routines unfolded with the comfortable repetition of normalcy. Kato walked to the settlement's eastern edge, where the forest opened into a small clearing. From here, he could see miles of wilderness stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that tree line, other settlements existed. Other communities of escaped families building lives from nothing. A network was forming, fragile but growing stronger each day. He thought about Corbin, wondering if the man still lived, wondering if punishment had been swift or prolonged, wondering if, in those final moments, Corbin understood that his actions mattered more than his past. But Kato also knew dwelling on such questions served no purpose. The future demanded attention, not the past. These families needed guidance. Children needed education. Defenses needed strengthening. Trade relationships needed establishment. The settlement behind him glowed with firelight. Voices carried on the evening breeze. Conversation, laughter, the sounds of people living rather than merely surviving. Kato whispered to the darkening sky, barely audible even to himself. Freedom is a beginning, not an ending. He turned from the horizon and walked back toward the warm glow of the settlement. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.